Black German Shepherd refuses to let baby sleep alone. Parents find out why and call the police. The early days of winter clung gently to the suburban streets of Brookpine, coating the sidewalks in a fine dusting of frost and breathing mist into the air with each breath. For Lucas and Emma Whitmore, the world had never seemed more perfect. Their quaint two-story house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its white shutters and bay windows glowing warmly in the early morning light. After years of trying, their dream had finally come true. A healthy, rosy-cheeked baby girl named Maya had arrived just 3 weeks earlier. Her cries were soft, her gaze already curious, and her presence transformed their home into something sacred. Emma, still wrapped in the cocoon of new motherhood, spent her days curled beside Maya's bassinet, humming lullabies in a voice that trembled with love and sleep deprivation. Lucas, a cybersecurity analyst for a federal agency, had taken leave from work to be home with his girls. Life, in all its fragile fullness, had gathered around them like the glow of a fireplace in winter. And always near, quiet but ever present, was Shadow. Shadow had been with them for 5 years, a black German shepherd with eyes as keen as candle flames and a silent, unwavering loyalty that had become a cornerstone of their little family. Emma often joked that Shadow wasn't just a pet, he was a sentinel. He had been rescued from a shelter as a puppy, his sharp mind and quiet intelligence evident even then. Over time, he became not only Lucas's jogging partner and Emma's shadow in the garden, but something else, a kind of guardian spirit, particularly alert and attuned to the family's rhythms. But since Maya's birth, something about Shadow had changed. At first it had seemed charming, protective even. He would press himself against the side of the bassinet, nose barely inches from Maya's sleeping form. Whenever Emma tried to carry the baby into another room, Shadow would follow so closely he nearly tripped her. They laughed about it at first, grateful for his devotion, but within days it stopped being sweet. The first night they left Maya alone in her nursery, Shadow had scratched at the door until his claws left grooves in the wood. When Lucas opened it, expecting a dog desperate to pee, Shadow rushed straight to the crib and stood stiff, ears pinned back, gaze locked on the window. Then came the barking. Loud, relentless, unlike anything they had ever heard from him before. Emma had scooped Maya up instinctively, heart pounding. "He's never done that," she whispered. Lucas shook his head, trying to calm the dog. "Maybe he's just nervous. It's a change for him too." They let it go. Maybe he was just adjusting, they told themselves. Maybe the nursery was new, and he didn't want to be separated. But then it happened again, and again. Every time Maya was left alone in that room, Shadow would lose control. Barking, pacing, growling low at the corners of the room, his hackles raised as if warding off some invisible threat. Then came the bite. Claire had been with them since before the birth, a family friend and a trained nanny. She was warm, maternal, endlessly competent. Emma had met her during a prenatal yoga class, and they'd formed an easy bond. When Claire offered to help during those first chaotic months, it felt like a blessing. She was gentle with Maya, always humming or reading softly, and Emma had felt instantly at ease, until Shadow changed around her too. It began subtly, growling when Claire entered a room, placing himself between her and the baby, refusing to obey commands when she was present. Lucas noticed first, his brow furrowing as he observed Shadow's fixed gaze on Claire's movements. "I don't get it," Emma said one night as they lay in bed. "He's never been like this with anyone." Lucas didn't answer at first. "It's not just nerves," he said finally. "He's trying to tell us something." The next morning, Claire reached down to pick up Maya from her crib, and Shadow lunged. His teeth grazed her forearm before Lucas pulled him back, barking, echoing off the walls like cannon fire. Claire screamed, stumbling away, her face pale. There was no blood, only a bruise, but it changed everything. Shadow was confined to the kitchen. Claire became distant, and Lucas couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head, trying to make sense of it. "I think he's dangerous," Claire said quietly later that day, cradling her arm. "He's unpredictable around Maya. You need to consider rehoming him before something worse happens." Emma hesitated. "He's part of our family." "So is your daughter," Claire replied. That night, Lucas sat at his desk in the study, fingers hovering above his keyboard. Something gnawed at him. Not fear, but a whisper of unease that wouldn't let him rest. Shadow had never shown unprovoked aggression, and yet there was something in the dog's eyes, the way he stood so still, so sure, like he could sense something none of them could. Lucas decided to install cameras in the nursery, not just the standard baby monitor, full hidden surveillance with motion triggers and night vision. If Shadow was wrong, they'd know. And if he wasn't, the first night passed without event, but when Lucas checked the footage the next morning, the files were gone. All of them, he told Emma, eyes wide. Every recording from midnight to 5 a.m. is missing. You set it to overwrite? Number, it shouldn't be possible. Unless someone deleted them deliberately. They tried again the next night. Same result. I'm backing them up separately, Lucas muttered, his voice grim. Encrypted, hidden. Let's see what happens now. That night, Emma sat up with Maya until midnight, then placed her in the crib and went to bed, exhausted. Shadow lay curled beside the nursery door, unmoving. Lucas stayed awake at his desk, watching the live feed, waiting. At 2:47 a.m., the screen flickered. Something moved at the window. Lucas sat bolt upright. The nursery window, which they always kept locked, was slowly sliding open. A figure, gloved hands, black clothes, a hood obscuring the face, climbed silently through and crossed the room to Maya's crib. Lucas's blood ran cold. He hit the alarm on his phone, shouting Emma's name as he ran down the hallway. But Shadow was already ahead of him, snarling, barking, hurling himself at the intruder with a fury that made the room quake. The figure leapt back, crashing into the rocking chair before scrambling out the window. Lucas caught only a glimpse, pale skin, eyes wild with shock, before they vanished into the night. The police arrived within minutes. A search of the house revealed what none of them expected. Behind the bookshelf in the study was a false panel, cleverly constructed. Inside it, the truth waited. Passports, cash, maps, notes with Maya's name, surveillance photos of Lucas's workplace, a gun. Claire, the gentle, soft-spoken nanny, was Elena Morano, an international agent under investigation for espionage. She had used her role to infiltrate Lucas's home, gain access to his systems through proximity to his child, and monitor his every move. Shadow, the dog they'd nearly banished, had seen the truth long before any of them had. By dawn, Claire was in custody, caught at the airport with a bag packed and a fake ID in hand. The officers shook their heads, stunned by the depth of the deception. "You're lucky your dog knew," one of them said. "He saved your daughter." That morning, as Emma held Maya close, and Lucas watched Shadow curl beside the crib once again, silent and watchful, a deep understanding settled in the room. Loyalty wasn't always gentle. Protection didn't always come with smiles. Sometimes it came with growls in the dark and eyes that never closed. And sometimes it came with a shadow, always by your side. The days that followed Claire's arrest unfolded like the unraveling of a tightly wound thread. Lucas sat in the dim light of his study, the footage of that night frozen on his computer screen, the hooded figure slithering through the nursery window, the glint of moonlight on her gloves, the expression of primal focus on Shadow's face just before he launched. It was all there in stark, undeniable clarity. Emma had barely slept since. The betrayal ran deeper than the fear. Claire, Elena, had sat at their table, fed their child, wiped spit up off Maya's chin, and smiled as she handed her back. She'd stood in the kitchen with Emma, sipping tea and offering motherly advice, while behind those warm brown eyes, a predator had been watching, waiting. Maya, blissfully unaware, cooed and waved her fists at the ceiling fan above her crib, her world still innocent and undisturbed. But everything else had shifted. Emma kept her close now, even more than before. Shadow never left the baby's side. He had returned to his quiet post, stationed near the crib, eyes soft only when Maya giggled or yawned, otherwise always alert, always listening. The news of the arrest had made its way to Lucas's colleagues, and by Monday, he was summoned back to the agency headquarters downtown. He hadn't planned on returning so soon, but when your home becomes the epicenter of an international threat, plans shift. His supervisor, Director Halden, met him with a grim handshake and a tight nod. "You look like hell," Halden said. "I've felt worse." Lucas handed over the hard drive with the backup footage. She was watching everything. She wasn't just there for Maya. She was gathering data on our internal systems, passwords, behaviors, patterns. And your home network, breached, but only passively. She hadn't yet accessed anything substantial. If it weren't for Shadow, Lucas's voice trailed off. Halden's expression didn't soften. "We've underestimated the scope of these quiet infiltrations. This wasn't just about you, Lucas. You were a test case, a trial run. We think there are others." That revelation twisted in Lucas's gut like a knife. "Maya was the bait," he said, his voice low. "Not just to gain my trust, but to keep me distracted. She wanted me emotionally compromised." "And she nearly got away with it," Halden replied. "You're lucky, but not everyone will be." The weight of that truth pressed down on Lucas's shoulders. Back home, Emma paced the nursery like a ghost, her gaze flickering to the window, now nailed shut and reinforced. She had already changed the locks, installed a new alarm system, and placed cameras in every room with separate encrypted feeds. Lucas's doing. But still, she didn't feel safe. Not really. She'd opened her heart to Claire, trusted her. That betrayal left bruises deeper than flesh. She hadn't even noticed the signs. The subtle avoidance when asked about her past. The way she always deferred questions with gentle laughter. How she seemed to know exactly when Emma was too tired to push. "She was always too helpful," Emma said aloud one evening as she rocked Maya. Lucas, sitting on the edge of the bed, glanced up. "I know. I should have seen it." "No," he said quietly. "She was good, trained to be invisible, to be perfect. You're not the one who failed, Em. She is. And I—" He paused, then rubbed his hands over his face. "I should have picked up on it sooner. I see patterns for a living. I missed this one because she got too close." Emma looked down at Maya, who blinked sleepily up at her. "Shadow didn't miss it." "No," Lucas said. "He didn't." They both looked toward the floor where Shadow lay, eyes half closed, head resting on his paws. But at the sound of Maya's soft whimper, he lifted his head immediately, ears flicking forward. The baby kicked gently in her mother's arms, then fell quiet again. Shadow lowered his head, but not his guard. Later that night, Lucas lay awake in bed, staring at the dark ceiling while Emma and Maya slept beside him. The house was silent save for the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock and the occasional gust of wind against the eaves. His mind churned with unanswered questions. Why had Elena targeted him specifically? Was it just his job, or was there something else? Something personal? The agency had been digging into her past, connecting threads across countries and names. Each alias more carefully crafted than the last, but none of it explained the emotional precision she had used. Her conversations with Emma, the way she had insisted on taking night shifts with Maya, the warm touches, the false comfort. It had all been part of the illusion. But what kind of person could hold a baby with such care while planning her exploitation? Lucas rose and walked to the nursery. Shadow was there, eyes glowing faintly in the dim nightlight. Lucas stood over the crib, watching Maya sleep, tiny hands curled into fists, mouth slightly open. Shadow's tail thumped once. Lucas knelt beside him. "I didn't trust you," he said softly. "I thought you were losing your mind." He ran a hand down the dog's back. "But you knew. You knew before any of us." Shadow didn't move, but there was a calmness in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement. In the following days, the agency assigned a detail to keep watch on the house discreetly, and a forensic team swept the home for further listening devices or trackers. They found one, tucked inside a stuffed animal Claire had gifted Maya on her first night home. It hadn't activated yet. "She was waiting," one of the agents said, "waiting until she needed more." Emma refused to let the toy stay in the house. She burned it in the fireplace that night, watching its plastic eyes melt into nothing. Trust, once scorched, was not easily rebuilt. But slowly the house began to breathe again. Maya laughed more. Emma began to leave the baby with Lucas long enough to shower or rest. Shadow no longer barked at shadows or growled at corners. But he never left her side. Not once. One afternoon, a reporter attempted to approach Emma outside the grocery store. She'd barely made it to the car when he cornered her, asking if she'd known who Claire really was. "Your dog's a national hero," he said, microphone shoved forward. "How did he know?" Shadow buckled in the back seat, let out a low, warning growl that made the reporter stumble back. Emma didn't answer. She drove away in silence. But later, she turned to Lucas in the kitchen, her voice quiet. "I think he's more than just a dog," she said. Lucas looked up from the sink, nodding slowly. "He's part of her now, like her shadow." Emma smiled faintly, glancing toward the nursery, where Shadow lay at his usual post, head on paws, eyes half closed but never truly asleep. Maya had begun to crawl that week, and every wobbly attempt across the rug was mirrored by Shadow's gentle steps beside her, as if he'd appointed himself her sentinel for life. And maybe he had, because sometimes when Lucas looked at him in the stillness of evening, he wondered if there was more to Shadow's intuition than animal instinct. If somewhere deep in that quiet soul was an understanding older than words. Trust had been broken, yes, but something else had been forged, something stronger, something built not from comfort, but from fire. And as the wind rattled the window panes and the world outside turned ever colder, inside their home, a single truth remained. They were never alone, not while Shadow stood watch. The frost clung longer to the windows that morning, the cold refusing to lift as though the house itself had internalized the unease of the past weeks. Despite the fire crackling gently in the hearth and the scent of cinnamon tea rising from the kitchen, there remained a strange stillness under the surface, like a breath held too long. Lucas sat in front of his home office desk, half-empty coffee steaming beside his keyboard. The encrypted data retrieved from Elena's hidden drive had been uploaded and handed to his agency, but Lucas kept a private backup, a forensic instinct he'd never been able to quiet. He stared at the cascade of code across his screen, eyes searching for a pattern, something they might have missed. Outside the sliding glass door, he could see the backyard. The trees stood bare, branches skeletal against the silver sky. Emma was walking slowly with Maya, nestled against her chest in a wool-wrapped sling, their steps tracing lazy arcs through the brittle grass. Shadow trotted beside them, never straying far, ears flicking at each sound, muscles fluid and alert. The sight stirred something soft in Lucas, but it was quickly eclipsed by a flashing error on his screen. His fingers froze. The decryption log he'd written, intended to alert him if anything in the encrypted files attempted external transmission, had just lit up. Something was still alive in the drive. Not just a passive data file, but a dormant worm, designed to activate only under specific network conditions. Lucas's jaw clenched. This wasn't over. He leaned in, tracing the code with careful precision. It was elegant in a way that was almost beautiful. Subtle commands nested within seemingly benign folders, waiting for a certain IP range to connect before springing to life. Elena hadn't just infiltrated his home. She had planted something sophisticated, something autonomous. His blood went cold as he realized it had pinged last night. At 2:18 a.m., he pushed his chair back and stormed down the hall, nearly colliding with Emma as she returned through the back door. "Did you notice anything last night?" he asked, breath coming fast. "Anything strange?" She blinked, tightening her arms around Maya. "Number Y? What's wrong?" "The drive. The one we recovered. It activated. Something triggered it. Someone tried to reach it." Emma's face paled. "From where?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He strode past her, unlocked the closet in the study, and pulled out the portable firewall he'd been developing in secret. A project for his agency, one not yet sanctioned. He plugged it into the drive and waited. The screen flickered, then flashed a series of numbers. Origin address, Vienna, Austria. Lucas stared, the air in his lungs suddenly thin. Elena wasn't working alone. Vienna had long been a known node for sleeper agents, a place for quiet reassignments and invisible resets. He didn't know why the connection had been attempted now, but it meant someone out there hadn't given up. "It's not over," he whispered. "She was just the beginning." Emma came closer, her voice low. "Lucas, do you think they'll come back?" He turned toward her, eyes dark. "If they think we still have something they need, yes. And they don't know what Shadow saw. They don't know what he stopped." That night, Lucas installed a secondary security network, isolated from the internet, running only on local feed with its own power source. Every camera was rerouted, every microphone rechecked. The nursery became the most secure room in the house. More than his office, more than even the agency's field hub. Emma didn't protest. If anything, she moved Maya's crib closer to their room and brought Shadow's bed beside it. There was something sacred in the way he watched over the baby, something that no system of wires and screens could replicate. And still, despite their best efforts, something new stirred in the quiet. Maya had begun waking at strange hours, always between 2 and 3 a.m., whimpering, not screaming, just unsettled, reaching toward the window with small, grasping hands. Shadow, every time, would rise first. He would position himself between the crib and the window, tail low, body tense, as though expecting something unseen. Lucas didn't sleep those nights. He would sit in the hallway, laptop in hand, the baby monitor's audio feed hissing softly beside him. One night, the motion alert blinked red. Lucas's hands shook as he tapped the feed. The nursery window remained closed. No movement outside. But in the grainy grayscale of the night vision camera, Shadow's head was turned toward the wall. Not the window, the wall. Lucas frowned and rewound the footage. There it was again. At 2:22 a.m., a brief flicker, barely perceptible, on the wall across from the crib. It looked like light, as if something had flashed just once. A reflection? Number. The curtains were drawn. There was nothing reflective nearby. It made no sense. He searched for a breach in the wall, any sign of tampering, but found nothing. He considered, for a wild moment, the idea of sound-based surveillance. Ultrasonic disruptions, high-frequency pulses, something beyond visible light. Something Maya could feel, but not understand. And Shadow, he could sense it. Not just hear or see, but feel. That instinct again. It all returned to Shadow. Later that week, Lucas met with Halden again, pushing his suspicions forward. They're still probing. Elena was the doorway, but someone else is pushing through. And the only reason they haven't succeeded is because of that dog. Halden raised an eyebrow. You think a German Shepherd is what's keeping an international spy ring from accessing classified intel? Yes, Lucas said flatly. Because he doesn't think. He doesn't hesitate. He acts when he senses danger. He knows who to trust. And right now, he's the only reason my daughter is safe. Halden studied him for a long moment, then nodded. We'll increase external surveillance. But Lucas, you need to be careful. These people don't just break into systems. They break people. When Lucas returned home, Emma met him with wide eyes. Someone was watching the house, she said, voice barely audible. From the street. A man. I saw him from Maya's window. He was just standing there. Then he turned and left. The word sent a chill through Lucas. He checked the exterior cams, but the figure had stayed in the blind spot, far enough to remain out of reach, but close enough to send a message. They were being watched. Shadow didn't sleep that night. He paced the hallway, checked every corner, sniffed the windows, then settled at Maya's door with his head lifted, eyes burning into the darkness. Lucas sat beside him. Neither spoke, neither moved, but together they waited. And in the silence of the early morning, something changed. Maya stirred in her crib, let out a soft cry, and then, without warning, reached over the side, her tiny fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. He turned, moved closer, and rested his muzzle against her palm. She giggled softly, and for the first time in days she fell asleep without another sound. Lucas watched, breath caught in his chest. Trust, once broken, was slowly mending. Not through passwords or security systems, but through a bond that defied logic, rooted in something primal. The world beyond their house would always be full of shadows, but inside there was one shadow that would never falter, one that would never let the darkness in. And in that, there was hope. Winter deepened its hold on Brookpine, the air sharp with stillness, every breath outside curling white and thin. The neighborhood was a picture of ordinary life. Chimneys trailing smoke, children crunching snow beneath their boots, porch lights glowing amber through the dusk. But inside the Whitmore home, the atmosphere remained coiled, taut as wire. The warmth of the fireplace and the familiar scent of pine wood couldn't mask the undercurrent of watchfulness that now threaded through each moment. Every creak of the floorboard, every gust of wind against the siding sent Lucas's eyes flicking toward the cameras, his body instinctively tightening. There was no peace in vigilance, only exhaustion measured in cups of cold coffee and red-rimmed eyes. Emma had learned to move quietly, her steps no longer carefree but careful, mindful of every light she turned on or left off. Even laughter, once spontaneous and frequent in their home, now emerged in cautious bursts like breath underwater. Maya, for her part, remained blissfully immune to the heaviness that clung to her parents. She had started babbling more, reaching for things with new intention, her tiny fingers gripping shadows and sleeves and bits of light like they were treasures. Her giggle had a piercing clarity that, for a moment, erased everything else, until the stillness crept back in. Shadow was always there, silent, loyal, a presence more than a pet. He moved with the grace of a soldier and the focus of something more ancient than instinct. His eyes flicked between the nursery window and the door, his posture calm but never relaxed. Even in sleep, his ears would twitch, responding to sounds beyond the range of human senses. Lucas had come to accept it. Shadow knew. He didn't need explanations, passwords, or briefings. Whatever darkness was hovering near, Shadow had already recognized it. Lucas just had to catch up. After another week of studying the residual data from the failed breach attempt, Lucas stumbled upon something chilling. Hidden deep in the code, nested under the decoy sequence Elena had constructed to mirror standard agency protocols, was a script written in a language Lucas hadn't seen since his earliest training, an obsolete dialect used during covert transmissions decades ago. It wasn't meant to function anymore, and yet here it was, intact, buried like a fossil beneath newer layers. Its presence didn't just raise questions, it confirmed them. This wasn't just espionage, it was legacy-level infiltration. Something older, deeper. A network that had been sleeping for years, waiting to be activated. It dawned on him slowly. Elena hadn't just come for him. She'd come for something buried in his work, something even he hadn't realized he had access to. That night, Lucas retrieved a locked binder from the agency's secure archives, an item only a handful of engineers knew existed. He brought it home in an unmarked envelope, tucked beneath his coat, and didn't speak a word of it to Emma. The less she knew, the safer she would be. But even as he worked late into the night deciphering the script, his thoughts kept returning to her, to the way she'd sat in the rocking chair the night before. Maya cradled in her arms, humming softly while the snow fell like whispers beyond the frosted glass. He couldn't lose that. He wouldn't. He glanced over his shoulder, and there was Shadow again, watching him from the doorway, eyes glowing faintly in the low light. There was something uncanny in his gaze, less like a dog waiting for a command, and more like a partner waiting for understanding. The following day, Lucas received an encrypted message through a private channel he hadn't used in years. No sender, no subject, just one line of text. You've seen it. They know. He closed the laptop slowly, his pulse hammering against his throat. He walked to the window and looked across the street. The car was back, the same dark sedan that Emma had noticed days ago. Same tinted windows, same spot under the lamppost. It hadn't moved all morning. He reached for his phone, then paused. There was no point in alerting local authorities. This was federal now. It had always been. He picked up Maya from her playmat, feeling her warmth against his chest, her tiny hand grasping the collar of his sweater. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, her breath soft and even. He kissed the top of her head and whispered, "We're going to keep you safe. I promise." When Emma entered the room, he handed her the baby with a strained smile and disappeared into the basement. There, behind an unfinished wall, Lucas unlocked the safe embedded in the concrete. From it, he withdrew a black box no larger than a hardback novel. Inside was a prototype he'd once developed as a contingency, a quantum seed capable of rebooting and rewriting any secure network it touched. It had been shelved for being too powerful, too dangerous in the wrong hands. And now those hands were reaching. The box was cold to the touch, humming faintly as he lifted it out. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Not the usual groan of old timber, but a sharp, deliberate weight. Lucas froze, every nerve standing on end. Shadow growled. Not loud, not showy, just a low, vibrating warning that seemed to roll through the foundation of the house. Lucas snapped the box shut and bolted upstairs 2 steps at a time. Shadow was already standing outside the nursery door, teeth bared, body braced. Emma stood on the other side of the room, clutching Maya to her chest. The window was ajar, only by a sliver, but it had been locked. Lucas's eyes darted to the curtain. It fluttered ever so slightly despite the heater being off and no air circulating. Shadow lunged forward, barking sharply, then stopped. He tilted his head, ears twitching, and growled again. Emma whispered, "Lucas, someone's been inside." The realization cracked across Lucas's mind like thunder. The sensors hadn't tripped. The cameras hadn't triggered. Whoever it was had bypassed everything. Every single layer of defense. Except one. "Shadow," Lucas said, barely breathing. "Show me." The dog moved with purpose, sniffing low, then suddenly veering toward the bookshelf. He stopped, paws scratching slightly at the baseboard. Lucas dropped to his knees and felt along the molding. His fingers met a seam, a faint groove. He pressed it, and with a gentle click, the panel gave way. A small, polished camera lens stared back at him, embedded where no device should have been. His breath caught. It wasn't theirs. He grabbed the panel and yanked it free, exposing a twisted series of wires snaking toward the wall. "They've been listening," he muttered. "For weeks, maybe longer." Emma held Maya tighter, her face pale. "How? We swept. Twice. Not for this. This is military-grade, field-embedded surveillance. Passive, leeching power from the wall socket." Shadow sensed it. That's why he stared at the wall every night. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The light flicker in the camera. The nightly wake-ups. Maya reaching toward nothing. It hadn't been nothing. It had been presence. Quiet, invasive presence. That night they didn't sleep. Lucas called in a private sweep team from his agency, specialists trusted with only the most compromised field sites. By dawn, they had uncovered 3 more hidden nodes, all designed to record audio and short bursts of video during night hours. The feeds had been wirelessly transmitting to a receiver nearby, likely the sedan. But the receiver was gone, vanished into the morning fog before the team could trace it. When the agents left, Lucas sat in the nursery alone, Maya sleeping soundly in his arms. The crib had been moved temporarily, the curtains drawn. The air was heavier now, thick with the residue of invasion. But it wasn't defeat he felt. It was something else. Clarity. The enemy had breached the surface, but in doing so, they had exposed themselves. And Lucas was no longer playing defense. He was planning a counterattack. He looked down at Shadow, who lay at his feet, eyes closed but far from asleep. Lucas reached down and placed a hand on the dog's head. "You saw it first. You always do." Shadow opened one eye and gave the faintest thump of his tail against the floor. In that quiet moment, something shifted. The fear remained, but beneath it, a steel resolve began to take root. They had tried to reach his family. They had used every tool, every deception. But they had forgotten one thing. You don't break into a fortress guarded by a shadow. The wind screamed that morning, rattling against the windows with the fury of a thing denied. Brookpine lay under a heavy sky, clouds coiling low and gray, as though the world itself held its breath. In the Whitmore household, however, there was no silence. Not anymore. It had been broken, shattered by the discovery of what had lain hidden in their walls, by the truth that someone had been watching their every move, breathing through wires and signals like a phantom in the dark. But it hadn't ended there. Not for Lucas, not for Emma, not for Maya, and certainly not for Shadow. Lucas paced the living room as he spoke quietly into a secure line, the final phase of a plan long in the making, forming in his mind. "I don't need more analysis," he said, voice low, calm. "I need them to think they've won." There was a pause, a soft crackle on the other end. "Lucas, you're talking about baiting them. That's not sanctioned. You have a family." "Exactly why I'm doing this," he interrupted. "They came into my home. They used my daughter, my wife. They wrapped themselves in the skin of trust and waited for us to sleep. I'm not waiting anymore. The voice on the other end exhaled slowly. You're going to need help. Lucas looked toward the nursery where Emma sat rocking Maya, her face tired but resolute, Shadow lying protectively at her feet. I already have it, he said and hung up. The plan was simple in design but complex in execution. Lucas knew they were still listening, or at least watching. So he fed them something worth biting. A message embedded in a fake email from a fabricated source in Vienna, referencing a supposed vulnerability in a classified communication system only someone of Elena's rank would have known about. He left it half encrypted, just enough to tempt a second breach attempt, and then he waited. The nights that followed were long, strung together by a tension that pulsed beneath every heartbeat. Maya had begun sleeping more soundly now, though she often reached for Shadow before drifting off, as if her tiny hands instinctively sought the presence she trusted most. Emma stayed close, more quiet than usual but never weak. She had grown into something Lucas hadn't fully expected, someone fierce, someone unwavering. This had changed her. It had changed them both. And the man Lucas had been before, the one who trusted too easily, who believed safety was something you could buy with enough code and locks, was gone. 3 nights later, the trap was sprung. At 2:41 a.m., the system Lucas had designed to simulate vulnerability lit up with an access ping, untraceable to the untrained eye, but not to him. He watched the stream in real time, eyes flicking across lines of code like a hunter watching for rustling leaves. The intruder was fast, methodical, but they weren't ready for what they stepped into. As the false network absorbed the breach, it began to trace backwards, unraveling the origin. And this time, it wasn't Vienna. It was local, less than 2 miles away. Lucas's heart stopped. Whoever had been orchestrating this had moved closer. They were in Brookpine. He launched the secondary script, a ghost protocol that fed back corrupted data laced with a traceable marker. It would take time to fully lock onto the device, but within minutes the system pinpointed it. A mobile relay van parked in a long-abandoned service lot by the railway tracks, just outside town. Lucas didn't wait. He didn't call it in. This wasn't something he could hand off. He left Emma with Maya, locking every door, handing her a burner phone and a firearm she never imagined she'd hold. If anything happens, he told her, don't hesitate. Shadow will stay with you. But the dog rose the moment Lucas reached for the front door. He stood there, body rigid, eyes locked on Lucas's. No, Lucas said, stay with them. Shadow didn't move. His tail didn't wag. He simply stared. Lucas knelt, placed a hand on the dog's head. You've already saved us once. Let me return the favor. But Shadow wouldn't yield. He followed Lucas to the car, leapt into the back seat without hesitation. And Lucas, exhausted, grateful, let him stay. The van was exactly where the system had marked it, cloaked in dust and ice, nestled between crumbling walls and forgotten signage. Lucas killed the headlights, parking 2 blocks away, and approached on foot. Shadow slinked beside him, silent as a whisper, his body low, senses trained forward. The air was bitter, the ground crunching under their steps. Lucas could feel the pulse of his own fear, but it no longer controlled him. The van's rear door was ajar, a narrow slit revealing a flickering monitor. He circled wide, checking for other movement. Nothing. He signaled Shadow to stay low and crept forward. Inside the van, it was like stepping into the nerve center of a serpent. Screens, wires, satellite relays, feeds showing the exterior of his house, infrared scans of rooms, audio spectrums of voices. And in the center, seated calmly, was a man Lucas had never seen before. Pale, clean-shaven, smiling. I was wondering how long it would take, the man said without turning. Lucas leveled the pistol. Turn around, slowly. The man obeyed. His eyes were a soft, unreadable gray. You're not what I expected, he said. Most people fold. You dug. You broke into my home, watched my family, threatened my child. We only watched. Elena acted beyond her directive. Lucas didn't blink. So you admit it. The man's smile didn't falter. You've already transmitted our location, haven't you? Of course. Then it's too late for both of us. And with that, he pressed a switch beneath the desk. The screens went black. Every relay shut down. Lucas lunged, but the man made no move to resist. Instead, he leaned back, arms raised as sirens wailed in the distance. "You think you've won?" he asked quietly. "You've only exposed a single node. There are dozens, and your little Shadow there." His gaze flicked to Shadow, who now stood in the doorway, growling low. "He can't follow all of them." Lucas didn't respond. He kept his gun trained until the agents arrived and hauled the man out. As they led him away, he turned one last time. "Enjoy your peace while it lasts." The van was impounded, the systems dismantled. The network's reach had been broken, at least for now. And in the days that followed, the weight that had pressed against the Whitmore home began to lift. The cameras came down. The hidden nodes were gone. The car never returned to the street corner. Emma began to smile again, not the cautious, fragile smile of fear barely contained, but the slow, genuine one of someone beginning to breathe. Maya laughed more. Her first real word came 3 days after the raid. "Da-da!" And Lucas had to excuse himself to cry in the hallway where no one could see. Shadow returned to his quiet vigil, but his posture softened. He no longer flinched at every creak. Instead, he began to rest more, allowing himself moments of peace. And Lucas found himself sitting on the back porch more often, coffee in hand, watching the trees sway in the wind. He wasn't naive. He knew the threat wasn't gone forever. Evil didn't evaporate with a single arrest, but they had survived, together. And not just because of wires or passwords, because of loyalty, because of instinct, because of a dog who had sensed what no one else had. One night, after tucking Maya in and watching her sleep with her hand resting on Shadow's fur, Emma joined Lucas on the porch. She leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we'll ever be normal again?" Lucas wrapped an arm around her. "No," he said softly, "but maybe that's not a bad thing." She looked up, eyebrows raised. "How do you mean?" He glanced inside where Maya shifted peacefully and Shadow's tail thumped once, slow and sure. "We were blind. We let comfort dull us. But now, we see, we listen, we protect. And maybe that's the kind of normal we're meant for." She nodded slowly, then kissed his shoulder. "I'll take it." And as the stars emerged above, casting silver light across the quiet neighborhood, the Whitmore home settled, not into fear, but into readiness, into watchfulness, into strength. Because some families are protected by locks and alarms. But the Whitmores, they had a Shadow, and he never slept.